to this panel discussion with the title The Nuclear Order at a Crossroads. My name is Martin Senn. I'm a professor of international relations at the University of Innsbruck, and it's my great pleasure to moderate tonight's event. This panel discussion is part of a research project on the complexity of nuclear ordering. Since the global nuclear order came into existence, states and non-state actors have developed a broad range of formal and informal institutions on the use or non-use of nuclear weapons, on nuclear disarmament, on nuclear non-proliferation, on nuclear weapons testing, on arms control, and civilian applications of nuclear energy. And while we know quite a lot on these individual elements of the nuclear order, with many books and articles on the NPT, the CTBT, or nuclear arms control, we know very little about how these different elements are interrelated and how they interact. So our research project on the complexity of nuclear ordering seeks to understand how different elements of this order are hanging together, how they interrelate, and how they produce unexpected and unintended effects, and also how the nuclear order as a whole interacts with other orders in world politics. This project on the complexity of nuclear ordering, and also tonight's event, is supported by the Austrian Research Association and its working group on peaceful change, by the University of Innsbruck, by the Vienna School of International Studies, and the Aurora University's network. So I also want to take this opportunity and thank these institutions for their support, and I also want to thank the technical staff that is working to send this event or to stream this event via Facebook and Twitter. So thank you very much for enabling this event on-site and online. I now have the great pleasure to welcome and introduce 5 outstanding experts on the global nuclear order. So on the very left-hand side, I would like to welcome Dr. Carmen Wunderlich. She is Assistant Professor at the Chair of International Relations and Development Policy at the University of Duisburg-Essen in Germany, and she's also Associated Researcher at the Peace Research Center in Prague. In her research, Carmen focuses on global norm dynamics and practices of norm contestation with a specific focus on issues relating to weapons of mass destruction. The next panelist that I would like to welcome is Ambassador Alexander Kmentt. Alexander Kmentt is the Director of the Disarmament, Arms Control and Non-Proliferation Department at the Austrian Foreign Ministry. In his long diplomatic career, Ambassador Kmentt has worked extensively on disarmament and non-proliferation issues, including as Deputy Permanent Representative of Austria to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva and as a Special Assistant to the Executive Secretary of the CTBTO. Many of you know that Ambassador Kmentt is also one of the architects of the initiative on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons and one key figure that facilitated the negotiation and the conclusion of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW. He was also responsible for the 2014 conference on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons in Vienna, and he is the designated president of the first meeting of the state parties of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. The next panelist that I want to introduce is Professor Harald Müller. Professor Müller is the former director and now associate fellow at the Peace Research Institute Frankfurt, and he is also supervisor of the Peace Research Center Prague at Charles University. Professor Müller has served as the co-chair of the working group on peace and conflict research of the German Foreign Office. He was the vice president of the EU Consortium for Non-Proliferation and was member of the German delegation of German delegations to NPT review conferences from 1995 to 2015. He was also member and chair of the UN Secretary General's Advisory Board on Disarmament Matters. In his academic career, Professor Müller has published extensively on many matters of nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. The next panelist on my right-hand side is Dr. Joelien Pretorius. She's an associate professor in political studies at the University of Western Cape, South Africa. She is a former honorary research fellow at the Archbishop Desmond Tutu Center for War and Peace Studies at Liverpool Hope University. Prior to her PhD studies at Cambridge University, she was the coordinator of the Center for International Political Studies at the University of Pretoria. Professor Pretorius is also a member of the Pugwash Conference on Science and World Affairs. In her research, she focuses on nuclear politics in Africa, Africa and the global nuclear order, and also the nuclear non-proliferation regime. Then a little bit further to the right side, I'd like to introduce Dr. Michal Onderco. He is an associate professor of international relations at Erasmus University, Rotterdam. Previously, he was a Max Weber Fellow at the European University Institute, a Fulbright visiting researcher at Columbia University in New York, and a junior faculty fellow at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. In his work, he focuses on the internal politics of the nuclear non-proliferation regime and also on the robustness of the nuclear taboo. And then I would also like to introduce our final panelist, who unfortunately cannot join us on the panel on site, but who joins us via Zoom. And this panelist is Professor William Walker. He is emeritus professor at the School of International Studies at the University of St. Andrews. In his research, he has focused on how to conceptualize and how to respond to problems that weapons of mass destruction pose for international order. He has also been examining the political institutional processes by which complex technological decisions and paths become entrenched, and we are very happy to have him here on this panel, even though he's only joining us via Zoom. But it's great to have you here with us today, William. Now, we move on to the many questions that we will address today, and I would like to make this in these questions in 3 steps. So first of all, I would like to start with some general questions on the overall state of the nuclear order. Then I would like to move on a bit to the situation that we're currently seeing in Ukraine, and then I want to connect those 2 sets of questions and ask our panelists how they think that the war in Ukraine will impact the global nuclear order. When we talk about the global nuclear order, we have an order in front of us that consists of essentially 3 pillars, 3 institutional pillars. The first pillar is the civilian use of nuclear energy and nuclear non-proliferation. The second pillar is deterrence and nuclear arms control. And the third pillar is nuclear disarmament. And I would now like to discuss with our esteemed panelists what the current state of those different pillars is. And I would like to start with the civilian use of nuclear energy and nuclear non-proliferation. And I would like to ask the panelists, so what are the major challenges and opportunities in this first pillar? So I would like to start with you, Harald. What are, in your view, the major challenges and opportunities with regard to the civilian use of nuclear energy and nuclear non-proliferation?
Well, it's a basic question about the future, notably from a Western European point of view, where nuclear after Fukushima, has become more unpopular. And it appears now that this trend might be reversed through the desperate attempt to reduce Western Europe's dependency on Russian primary energy resources. We have already seen a Belgian decision to prolong the phase-out time. Similar things are discussed now in Germany. And of course, all this is in a strong contrast to the experience in Ukraine, where civilian nuclear power plants have indeed been attacked. That is, the facility, the area, has indeed been attacked and partially occupied, which highlights the undercurrent risks which nuclear facilities are under when wartime comes. In terms of non-proliferation, I think the biggest challenge might be to withstand the possible consequences of the Ukrainian experience. Ukraine is a non-nuclear weapon state, and it is a non-nuclear weapon state because it has renounced the possession of the inherited nuclear weapons inherited from the Soviet Union in 1994. Ukraine was granted territorial and economic integrity in the so-called Budapest Memorandum, to which Russia, the United States, and Great Britain are also partners, and one of the four has indeed attacked and thereby negated the promises of the memorandum. And there is a distinct risk that this experience before the eyes of the world might lead to a reconsideration of the renunciation of nuclear weapons in non-nuclear weapon states that have the capability to move forward to a nuclear armed arsenal and thereby hurt the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the whole non-proliferation regime very badly, to the detriment of international security.
Thank you. Let's move on to the second pillar, to deterrence and arms control. So, Joelien, what is your assessment? What are the major challenges and opportunities in this second pillar of the nuclear order?
Well, firstly, I'd like to say that there are two opposing ordering principles that can be used to order this issue area. The one is nuclear deterrence, and the other one is eliminating nuclear weapons. And nuclear deterrence and the elimination of nuclear weapons cannot exist together. That is a problem. Because the first, nuclear deterrence, constructs a world in which nuclear weapons are legitimate defense tools, and they are used for international peace, security, and stability. The second ordering principle, the elimination of nuclear weapons, constructs a world in which these weapons are illegitimate and inhumane. And unfortunately, the main treaty that we have, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, tries to connect these two into one. If we look at the negotiation history of the NPT, we see that the Soviet Union and the US cooperated around this treaty based on enhancing their deterrence capability. And so nuclear deterrence, even though it's not an explicit pillar of the NPT, is in fact at the heart of the NPT. Are we then surprised that the nuclear order is unraveling when these opposing ordering principles are moving the groups inside of the NPT further apart? Those who depend on nuclear deterrence and those who want the elimination of nuclear weapons. So that is a primary problem. Now let me bring in my views on nuclear deterrence and arms control as such. Some analysts see nuclear weapons as political, not military weapons. They will never be used. They're only there to prevent coercion and deter aggression. And as such, they avert wars. There are so many assumptions in this notion that is shaky and downright dangerous. The assumptions are that actors are rational, that they're all on the same page about nuclear deterrence, that there won't be miscalculation or accidents that lead to a first strike and sets off a nuclear war. not to mention the consequences of nuclear deterrence, which include arms races and holding civilians at ransom. So what we see also is that states don't just use deterrence simply to deter a nuclear strike from another nuclear-armed state. They use it as blackmail to do what they want to do. So let's come to arms control, which we see as complementing deterrence with reassurance. In other words, we introduce into the security dilemma of nuclear weapons some sensibilities. We limit nuclear weapons. We introduce trust in deterrence relationships. But for me, nuclear arms control is like the Mr. Smee to the character of Captain Hook in the story of Peter Pan. Captain Hook is an irrational character. That's his essence. Mr. Smee can calm him down, but at the end of the day, he remains an irrational character. And that is what nuclear deterrence is. It is a dangerous concept, and nuclear arms control can only do so much. And that is what I see as a problem and a risk, especially what we've seen now after the end of the Cold War, that more of these nuclear arms control treaties are being scrapped, and trust-building mechanisms as well.
Thank you. Michal, I would be interested in hearing from you. Do you think that overall deterrence relationships have become more stable or less stable, and which factors have impacted the stability or instability of deterrence?
That's a very easy question on a Friday afternoon. Okay, that's not the question I was preparing to answer. I think, okay, the overall deterrence relationships, given that there are multiple layers or deterrence, some of them assured by nuclear weapons, where you know, as Thomas Schelling once said, it's a certainty that leaves up something up to the chance. So you have some sort of certainty, but you actually don't have a certainty because there is always a risk or a chance that something will go wrong. But you also have different developments, and these developments are both political but also technological. We have emergence of new technologies that are undermining existing deterrent relationships. We have emergence of technologies that may make, at some point, nuclear deterrence less stable. And so overall, there is on one hand this sort of seeming stability of the relationships, but there is a lot of tendencies happening at the moment on the sidelines that could potentially, over a long-term period of time, make deterrent relationships much more unstable. And in the same way as that those tendencies might make deterrent relationships in any regional context more unstable, they could also make the deterrence between great powers more unstable. So that would be my answer to this question.
Thank you. Now moving on to the third pillar of this order, the pillar of disarmament. Alexander, the question to you, what is in your view, what are the major challenges, but also maybe the opportunities that are in this third institutional pillar?
Well, first of all, thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm obviously the only non-academic on this panel, so I'm speaking more from the practical diplomacy side. So, I mean, what is the nuclear order from the state perspective? It's a set of rules and instruments, the norms that set the framework. And these norms, of course, have been set predominantly by the states that have these weapons. Since the Cold War, the instruments that we have been set predominantly by those states with some participation from the rest of the world. And the three pillars that you mentioned, of course, are strongly interrelated because at the center of this normative framework is the NPT, which represents a sort of grand bargain of the international community, that you have the principle of non-proliferation, and in exchange for that you have access to nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, and you have the promise for disarmament. And specifically on this disarmament front, the picture is extremely dire, because we in fact are not moving in the direction of disarmament, and this is not something that is new. In fact, we're looking back at 25 years of wasted opportunities and progressive dismantlement of this normative order, with some of the bilateral treaties between Russia and the US having been ditched, and the implementation of the promises that have been given hasn't been forthcoming. So the trust, and that is what what ultimately holds the nuclear order together, is the feeling that for the vast majority of states that they are engaged in a normative framework that is fair and that serves the interests of basically most of them, and it also makes clear who's breaking the rules. I think that's the normative framework. And on the disarmament side, that has been very, very seriously challenged. So the NPT bargain is in very, very serious trouble, and what we're seeing in Ukraine now is potentially even more a tipping point, because of course if you have a nuclear weapon state using the threat of these weapons to be able to wage a brutal conventional war against a non-nuclear weapon states, that puts the whole trust in this normative framework very much at stake. So we're in a really very, very dire moment, that not just by what we're seeing east of here, but also in terms of the trust of the international community that this system is going to hold. So it's a really very, very crucial moment. And there, of course, because that's also my role as President-designate of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which is the sort of the new kid on the block as far as the nuclear order is concerned. It's a new treaty that looks at it that looks at these weapons at a completely different way, from a value-based and delegitimizing point of view, that these weapons, because of their consequences and risks, are so unacceptable that the only way to get out of this paradigm is to really move into the direction that there are no right hands for these weapons and they should be gotten rid of altogether, which of course is a tall order, and we see developments in the opposite direction right now. But we are at the crossroads, that either we jump back as international community into the 1950s and we start a new nuclear arms race with many more stakeholders. We've been there, we've done that. It's not necessarily been a very safe and secure world. Or we find ways to use this as an opportunity to actually safeguard and even strengthen this regime, but some very important things have to change. That would be my answer.
Thank you. Carmen, you're studying norm development, norm emergence, norm entrepreneurs. So what is your assessment of the current state of nuclear disarmament? Where are the challenges? Where are the opportunities?
Thank you, Martin. I don't have really much to add to what Ambassador Kmentt already said, but if you look at the normative evolution of the nuclear order from a bird's perspective, we see a lot of dynamic development. And from the institutional basis, there's a lot that we could, in principle, use. There are a lot of recommendations. If you look into the Non-Proliferation Treaty final documents, there are lots of measures that are proposed regarding de-alerting, regarding concrete reductions, regarding I would say, emerging, a norm that has been emerging regarding the accountability of nuclear weapon states to actually follow through with their disarmament obligations. But what is lacking, and Ambassador Kmentt has already mentioned that, is the political will. We don't see action. So we have a really great mishap between rhetoric and reality and actions. But if we look at the TPNW, which has entered into force this year, we also see quite some interesting normative developments. We see a broadening of the of agency. We see access or let's try to put it another way. We see that agents can access norm contestation, can access norm negotiation processes that have otherwise been denied that place at the negotiating table, right? Non-state actors, smaller states, weaker states. And I think this is a really important development from a normative perspective, because that it may not lead to real nuclear tangible disarmament, because therefore for this to happen we need the nuclear weapon states, but it's very important normative commitment shown by non-state actors, by, well, I would say humanity, which will of course be the target of possible nuclear use. And this is a very strong commitment, a very strong signal that we see there. We just need to be reminded of the importance of keeping nuclear disarmament on the agenda, even in these dire times. Some say that this may not be the time to think about nuclear disarmament. I would say these are the times we really need to think of nuclear disarmament. We need to think about how we can reduce the dangers emanating from nuclear weapons, how we can reduce the risk of inadvertent or advertent nuclear use. And therefore, I think the TPNW is an important sounding board to broaden the agency, broaden the group of actors, and also to keep the norms that we already have.
Thank you. Harald Müller wants to add to the points on disarmament, and then I'll hand over to William Walker, who also has raised his hand. Harald, please.
Yeah, I think one has to be very realistic about the present situation, and it's a bitter moment for me to say so, because I have devoted the better part of my academic career to exploring ways how we can come closer to a world without nuclear weapons. The present situation leads us straight forward in the other direction. I have already indicated that in my statement on non-proliferation, but I have only the look at the situation of the alliance to which my own country is a member, NATO. I could have imagined some 2 months ago to discuss in a serious way alternatives to the nuclear weapons deployed in Europe, including on German territory. This moment is completely over, and it will take a lot of time to bring it back. Presently, some of the small members of NATO to the east are extremely concerned about the possibility that they could become the next victim of the restoration of the Soviet Empire. And they demand very strongly not only more for their defense, but also to set against the Soviet juggernaut the continuation of extended deterrence by the United States. That's the way it is, and the way the politics in Western Europe are developing mean that this desire will be there for very, very long, maybe until the type of leadership in Russia goes somewhere else.
Thank you. William, Alexander Kmentt just mentioned earlier that the different institutional pillars that we are talking about are of course constantly interacting, which is also very much at the heart of the project that I mentioned earlier. So can you tell us a bit about how those different institutional pillars have interacted in recent years, and maybe can you tell us, if that's possible, what is the state of the global nuclear order as a whole? How would you describe that?
Well, thank you very much, and I'm very sorry not to be sitting with you, but to be somewhere else. I wondered if I could draw a wider, talking about interaction, talk about the interaction of the debates about nuclear weapons and nuclear power with the wider range of very tough issues being addressed by states and people. And even before the Ukrainian crisis, there was talk of the world experience of polycrisis, of many concurrent crises that required, each of them required very deliberate and consensual action. And they were, I suppose, at the top of the tree was the global warming and the loss of biodiversity. Then there was the problem of the economic stress and inequality, and that's going to be increased in severity, I think, by automation and many other changes happening in the structure of the world economy. Then on top of that came the pandemic. Then there was the question of the challenges to democracy and to governance and the loss of trust in institutions and the general weakening of institutions. So all of these issues are going to be very high on the agenda of states. And I have to say that until recently, until the Ukrainian crisis, nuclear issues were sinking on the international agenda. Of course, there were many people who were deeply concerned about it, but they were struggling to get voices, get heard. And there's no doubt that this crisis has now elevated nuclear weapons up towards the top of the agenda again. The question is, will they stay there? And will states really begin to get a grip on some of the very serious issues that are faced in this context? And that, of course, depends on many things. It depends very much on what's just been mentioned, the future of Russia, and what kind of government there is in Russia. And it's extremely hard to see how, certainly in the nuclear context, any kind of agreement can be reached with a government led by the current leadership, Mr. Putin and his colleagues. But I think probably above all it depends, and I don't like saying it depends on the hegemonic powers, but I think it probably does. It depends on the China joining with the United States and others in really taking an interest in the nuclear order and beginning to see that it's in their best interest to build upon the institutions that are already there and not getting, I mean, it has been participating in an arms race now, but not getting sucked completely into it and challenging the outside world through nuclear weaponry and indeed other kinds of weaponry. And so I would say that one of the important things here, not just in this context, but in other contexts, is we need to get over this idea that China and the West, in quotes, are at loggerheads. There needs to be some kind of getting together to solve all these great problems. Otherwise, I fear that we are going to be in very, very difficult territory, and not just in relation to nuclear weapons, in the wider context of this polycrisis that's facing us all.
Thank you. I'd now like to move on to the role that nuclear weapons have played or are still playing in the current war against Ukraine. Michal, the first question to you, but it's all open for the entire panel, of course. Under which circumstances do you think that Russia would use nuclear weapons? Obviously, I'm asking because this question has been on the mind of many, many people and has been very much in the media. So what is your take on this?
Thank you very much. I want to start by saying that despite a lot of the rhetoric and commentary that we see in the media, the aversion to the use of nuclear weapons among the ordinary Russians is not dissimilar to the one that we see among other Western Europeans, among Western Europeans, sorry, without other. Together with my colleague, we have conducted a research, and here I'm plugging my own work, where we asked Russians using a survey last year about the number of scenarios where they could imagine their country use a nuclear weapon, and the support for that was fairly low. It's depending on scenario, it was a maximum support was 27%, which is quite low. So the general public would generally not be super enthusiastic about it. Now, of course, that in an authoritarian country like Russia, that is not the full story. Of course, Putin's regime cares about the public legitimation, but it's not the full story. One of the potential scenarios that I think could lead potentially to the use of nuclear weapon, and that risk I judge at this moment to be very low, is in case the conflict widens to either spread to territories of the current NATO members, or if NATO actually becomes involved in the boots on the ground way in Ukraine. And those are, I think, two circumstances when I could imagine that eventuality happening. Having said this, as I said, I still judge that likelihood to be very low, and I hope that we will not see a day when this reality will prove me wrong.
Can I?
Sure.
Sorry that I speak so much, but
No, it's good.
one
It's
is
fine.
excited about that. I think it's interesting to watch how deterrence worked in this present war. When President Putin made his so-called declaration of war, March 23rd, he made a very general threat that Russia might do something unprecedented to those countries who supported Ukraine. This was generally understood as a nuclear threat, but it was largely ignored by NATO's members who supported Ukraine by an unprecedented flow of weaponry, by the admittance that volunteers may go there, and of course by sanctions, economic sanctions on a very, very large scale. There was no nuclear answer from Russia. On the other hand, NATO made it also very clear that they had no intention to send soldiers on the ground or to send their own aircraft to interfere in the course of the war. And that showed that at one red line, deterrence was working. Of course, we don't know whether this continues forever. But it gives the impression that both sides have red lines so far that they wish to respect.
Alexander.
There's so much to say. It's really incredibly complex. First of all, I would say we shouldn't talk about how deterrence has worked, but how it was used. I think that's an important. It was used to be able to, as I said before, to wage a brutal conventional war against a non-nuclear weapon state. It has worked to the extent that NATO has responded very cautiously and prudently, but it has not deterred the West to provide incredible amount of weaponry. And at the same time, the West has responded with the most comprehensive non-nuclear deterrence package ever, with international delegitimization of Russia and unprecedented economic measures, which are working. And of course, they don't work immediately, but they work in the long run. And at the same time, the hesitation or the cautious approach by the US has probably led to anxiety in some of the Eastern European countries about the reliance of extended US deterrence. So there are lots of open questions, I think, how the discussion around deterrence will develop. And I think there are also extremely important questions about the legitimacy of nuclear deterrence given what we are seeing. And the second point, if I still can add, responding to Professor Müller's point, the security concerns in Eastern Europe are absolutely legitimate and fully understandable, and right. And I think the help for those countries is absolutely important, and the reassurance. The question is nuclear extended deterrence the right answer? Because what it actually is, you cannot talk about nuclear deterrence without talking about the use, because nuclear deterrence relies on the credible use. And I think that is, most people think about it deterrence will mean that it will not come to it. But you have to think about that it comes to it, because otherwise deterrence is not credible. So, for example, the Baltic states, the question is really not, do you want to be under extended deterrence, but in practical terms, do you accept the US, for example, using nuclear weapons on your behalf? Because that's really what it is. And if you ask this question, when, how, against whom, where, these are the important discussions that need to be asked and had. And there I think the perspective, the discussion around nuclear weapons may start looking differently. And I agree that we have now a completely different situation in Europe, that the debate is back and it can go either way. And then also the last point I make, we mustn't be so Eurocentric. Of course, we in Europe are Eurocentric, but the debate is a global one. And the legitimacy and the nuclear order, there are many more stakeholders and not just in Europe. And all of this looks entirely different from the African perspective or from the Latin American perspective. Thanks.
Thank you. Michal.
I want to add something, because there was something in what Ambassador Kmentt said that sort of triggered the reaction. I think I don't want to speak for anyone who lives in the Baltic country, because I don't come from a Baltic country. I know a little bit the predicament, but I cannot speak for them. But I can imagine if you are an official in a Baltic country, and you feel that there is a threat to your east, and your option is either to rely on your security with the United States, and you know that nuclear weapons are part of that package, because ever since the early days of Cold War, the US presidents are unwilling to commit huge amount of weapons into, huge amount of human resources, so soldiers and weapons into Europe, because it's costly. So nuclear weapons are sort of immoral but cheap way out. Or the option is to rely on your security on a country where a foreign minister dances with Vladimir Putin at her wedding. I think the option is sort of clear, right? Like, can you, who are you going to trust to have your back?
Well, I don't think it was on the agenda that Austria would give security guarantees, right?
No, no. No, but it's about who do you trust in that relationship, and I think it's one of those things that many Eastern European countries didn't think that they had the back of their Western European friends for a long time. So NATO was the obvious way out. And I'm sorry for picking on Austria in here. It was sort of a cheap shot.
Joelien.
Yes, I'd just like to respond. So the risk might seem low, but it's real. And the longer this war continues, the bigger the risk that there will be nuclear use. And I say this because if you look at the doctrine, the nuclear doctrine of Russia, it says that if Russia's existence is a threat, it will use nuclear weapons. Now that's up for interpretation. In this war, it said if NATO or a third party becomes directly involved, what does that mean? Again, up for interpretation. Is it a no-fly zone? The Americans seem to think that it is. That would mean nuclear weapons will be used. Strangely enough, the American intelligence is very worried if we see the preparations they are now making. Would Putin interpret Russian nuclear doctrine as him and his regime being under threat, and not just Russia? So pushing him into a corner, he might think this is enough and use nuclear weapons.
Thank you. I want to give Alexander Kmentt the opportunity to dance the dance with me.
No, I mean, that was a bit of a cheap shot. I happen to agree with you that this wedding really was not a very good idea at all. But that's not the topic of the discussion here. We're talking about security and whether nuclear weapons at the end of the day are the answer to the security challenges that we face. I just wanted to add, because when you made the points about the likelihood of use of nuclear weapons, what is often forgotten is actually the fog of war and the crisis dynamics, where you have stakeholders who think that they can act rationally and they are in control of developments, and that is actually usually not the case. And now imagine the previous US president in Washington, and we all wondering what is the state of mind of Mr. Putin. It boils down to the to individuals, which adds to a lot of risk and uncertainties. So I think these are the kind of discussions that we need to answer, because we cannot get it wrong with nuclear weapons, simply because the consequences are global, and they affect Austria just as much as any other country. And so I also wanted to make the point about the global dimension of the debate. Yeah. I'm not going to argue with you about the wedding.
I now have a question for William Walker and for Carmen Wunderlich then as well. Do you think that the nuclear dimension of the war in Ukraine has challenged or reinforced our assumptions, our theories of deterrence, also our assumptions about the role that nuclear weapons play in conflict? William, what is your take on this?
I think it has challenged those assumptions, and I think they were already being challenged before the war in Ukraine. I mean, one of the very serious issues is to do with cyber and cyber warfare and how that affects the reliability of nuclear deterrence. Mm-hmm. What games can be played with interfering with one another's communication systems and command and control systems. And I would suggest that the debate about nuclear weapons actually has several sides to it. And of course, what Alexander Kmentt has said about the disarmament question and Harald about deterrence and so on is absolutely right. But even within the enclaves within the nuclear weapon states, there are some very serious issues that are having to be faced about the whole practice of nuclear deterrence and the reliability of nuclear deterrence. And one of all of our tasks here is actually to try and ensure that these debates happen, not just in public, but in private. And they happen within countries, but also across countries. And to make sure that they're not evaded and pushed to the sideline. And so simply, there's a kind of declaration in trust on nuclear weapons and all the rest of it, and that we can live with the current institutions and norms and so on. There needs to be a very serious debate. And my hope is out of this terrible crisis in Ukraine, which I should say also is a Russian crisis, that this will happen, that in fact that we will engage with this in a very serious way, inside and outside states. And my last thing is, I mentioned the climate crisis. In a way, I just wonder whether the two issues come to be joined in some respect, in the sense they're both existential crises. And if the nuclear crisis comes to be seen as an aspect of the crisis to biodiversity and the whole bio world, then perhaps that gives an increasing fillip to the push, to the whole endeavor to try and sort out this problem.
Thank you. Carmen, what is your view?
Maybe I can just add on what William just said. I think what it also needs now, not only to maintain the debate about nuclear weapons and the role of nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence, both in state fora and in diplomatic fora and politics, but also disarmament education and the education about nuclear weapons and their effects. And I think there, I mean, I only have a very good command of the German context. I'm teaching at the university, and I know that there's quite some interest in these issues in the recent years, but the institutional structure is missing, right? These topics are not in the curricula. There are no textbooks. There are no courses, or only at very, very rare places. So I think we should really do something to turn that in another direction, to have more school courses on nuclear weapons, to talk about nuclear weapons in public, and to have more education also with regard to like journalistic accounts on nuclear weapons. And while I'm saying that, I'm also observing with some concern that what I call nuke speak is again coming to the fore. If you follow Twitter since the invasion of Russia in Ukraine, there are so many new experts on nuclear weapons talking about the use of tactical nuclear weapons, talking about weapon types and about bombs, and completely forgetting about the humanitarian impacts that nuclear weapons would have. And I think this is really something that concerns me and that we should also keep in mind. Yeah, maybe I leave it here. And
okay, thank you. Now the final question that I have for all panelists, and then I would like to open for questions from the audience. And this is a huge question. Where and how do you think that the war in Ukraine will affect the nuclear order? Carmen, you want to go first?
Where and how will it affect the nuclear order? It already has affected the nuclear order, I would say. And to what extent it will affect the nuclear order, and whether this has a, I wouldn't say strengthening, and also positive is not the right word, whether it's deeply weakening or whether we are able to maintain an order depends ultimately on how you approach order. And if we start with what is the imperative to create a nuclear order, I would say, for me personally, I think it's the prevention of nuclear use, the prevention of nuclear war. And I think this war has already had an impact on that ordering imperative, because the prospects of nuclear use, it's there, it's tangible. And we need to deal with that, right? We need to think about, even though I would agree with Harald that it's really difficult to envision meaningful nuclear disarmament steps, we need to think about a way to reduce the dangers linked with nuclear weapons. We need to come up, and when I say we, of course, I mean the state level, I mean the nuclear weapon states, but I mean also allies of nuclear weapon states, but I also mean the public and experts, scientists coming up with ideas and keeping the debate alive, as I already said in my first remark. I think this is all. We cannot really foresee how the nuclear order will get out of that, because that's an ongoing process. Things will happen not only with regard to nuclear weapons or possible nuclear weapons use. I mean, there are also unfortunately other types of weapons of mass destruction, right? We have also heard Putin talking about a possible bio or chemical weapons laboratories in the Ukraine, which we know there are no such experiments taking place, but that could also be used as a pretext to use even more force, be it of a nuclear kind or any other thing, right? So we have to worry really about what is happening, what will happening in the Ukraine, and we should really also think about how can we kind of reduce the risks of weapons of mass destruction being used, and also, of course, with regard to more conventional attacks. But it's a difficult question. Sorry.
Thank you. Alexander, please.
Yeah, it's a difficult question. I agree with Carmen's point. I think the honest answer is nobody knows. It's too early to say, except we all know that the impact will be profound and has already been profound, but how it will develop, of course, depends entirely how the situation unfolds in the future. It's a sort of, the spectrum ranges from it's going to be terrible. It's entirely possible that nuclear weapons may be used. It's entirely possible that chemical weapons may be used. It's entirely possible that we're going back into a absolutely very dangerous arms race dynamic which would have many more stakeholders than we had in the 50s and 60s. We have entirely possible that the non-proliferation line in the sand will not hold, because essentially if the answer to this crisis is more reliance on nuclear weapons, this is an example that is going to be set to the rest of the world, and then are we going to be in a safer world if more or less everybody has these weapons, or everybody is under some kind of deterrence relationship? It can go that way. Use of nuclear weapons, absolutely horrible. Changing the parameters completely can lead to a disarmament dynamic. It's possible, we don't know. Even if we avert this crisis, depending on what will happen in Russia, of course, there may be a focus on restarting, so that's also possible. I think we don't know yet. What we definitely see is that I think all of us in this nuclear debate, we've struggled mostly in the last few years that we all know that it's an important issue and nobody else cares. And I think that has changed. We will have a much, much bigger multi-stakeholder debate, which is a good thing because it's such an existential issue. I agree with William Walker. It's on the par with the other existential crisis, climate change, and needs to be addressed in a common security approach at the end of the day. So, sorry, I'm spreading this a bit too much. The short answer is we don't know. It can go multiple ways, and I think it's absolutely important. I think that we do not take it for granted that we are now entering a period of more focus on nuclear deterrence and nuclear weapons, but that we also look for alternatives. And I think that is what I think is extremely important. That's why I also think the debate around the TPNW can be very important in the near future.
Thank you, Harald.
Yeah, I think the present war has brought the nuclear order closest to a complete breakdown as it ever was. At the same time, one can read it and should read it as another proof that nuclear security will only be possible in a world without nuclear weapons, which of course gives disarmament a mighty push. History has taught us that even the very moderate disarmament and arms control steps which have been taken during periods when the nuclear weapon states were at reasonable relations, and did not happen when tensions among them were very high, which means that for the foreseeable future, until either a new government in Russia or, and I hope for that, some compromise solution for Ukraine, to which everybody agrees. Before that, I don't think that we see any movement towards nuclear disarmament in any way, which is another risk for the nuclear order.
Thank you. I'd like now to hand over to William Walker. William, what is your answer to this very difficult question?
I think I would just like to return to nuclear power. And of course, the attacks on the nuclear power stations in Ukraine have been conducted with conventional weapons. And my sense is that any country that is in a potential conflict zone will begin to look rather differently at nuclear power. I've recently been receiving some comment from Japan on the debate that's been ignited in Japan again about its nuclear power. And of course, it's in a zone where it's imaginary, at least, that these facilities might be attacked by North Korea, China, or whatever. So what we badly need is some kind of really strong international convention protecting nuclear power stations in time of war. How to construct that and how to make it believable and trustable is, of course, a big question. But I'm sure that this is one issue on which a lot of people can actually join. And of course, it's the civil authorities and the energy providers will be keen on this. Again, whether this can happen, we'll just have to wait and see.
Thank you. Joelien.
Thank you. So there's so many people that I've spoken to in arms control that say the only way that we will have disarmament is if there is a nuclear accident or a nuclear explosion and a disaster. And then people will rise up and they will demand elimination of nuclear weapons. But that could also mean extinction for human beings. So do we want to risk that? So what I'm going to say now might be quite controversial for a European audience, but I'm speaking as a South African, and what Ambassador Kmentt said is this is a global issue. So the problem that I have with the US response is that it is not strategically oriented to a speedy end of the war. And as I've said, the longer the war continues, the more likely that nuclear weapons could be used in this war. For me, it seems that the US and the West currently is gearing their response towards regime change in Russia. And they're doing this by providing Ukraine with enough military support to bog down Russia, but not to trigger a nuclear war with Russia. So they're just avoiding that red line, to isolate the country diplomatically, economically, and through a global public media campaign that demonizes Putin. Thirdly, they are trying to reduce domestic support for Putin in the hope that some Russian elites, the oligarchs perhaps, will depose of him. But there is no certainty that this strategy will work, and it is prolonging the war, the destruction in Ukraine, humanitarian cost, and the risk of nuclear war. The problem with the US response seems, for me, to be its inability to see the crisis in a bigger context of the post-Cold War world and the US's own conduct in that world. In Putin's mind, Russia is not simply fighting the Ukrainians. It is fighting an unbalanced world order where the US is the hegemon, where it engages in wars at will, where it gets away with a lot of things that it's now accusing Russia and Putin of. The killing of civilians, the targeting of civilian areas in its war in Syria and in Iraq. Promises to expand NATO to the Russian border was not sensible, and specifically in the light of NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements, which Russia highlighted at the 2015 NPT review conference as unacceptable to them. It would bring nuclear weapons to the border of Russia. What I see should be done to avoid this is that President Biden can reframe this crisis as his Cuban Missile moment. He must use the risk of nuclear war to negotiate an end to the war. And he must do this with Putin. Whether he hosts diplomatic or negotiations with Zelensky present and put on the table some things that will help this conflict to a speedy end. It could be guarantees for Ukraine not joining NATO, some guarantees for Russian-speaking minorities in Ukraine, even a form of self-governance. And that sanctions might be relaxed if the hostilities end immediately. Now, this may sound like appeasement, and for a European audience who have framed this crisis in World War II terms, it is very hard to see the rest of the world trying to find other ways to interpret this. My own government, South Africa, as you probably know, has been on the fence about how to interpret this, and has tried to leave open more room to negotiate with Russia. So this is where I'm coming from. In my opinion, the trajectory of the war narrative that we have at the moment, the mainstream war narrative coming from the West, is on course for nuclear weapons use. And that is the worst outcome that we can have, even if it feels negotiating with Putin is unacceptable.
Thank you. I'm very sure that there will be questions also on the perspective and the solution that you presented. But now, last but not least, I want to give Michal the words on the question of the impact of the war on the global nuclear order.
Thank you very much. I want to, in my abusing the fact that I'm the last in the whole lineup, I want to come back to something that Carmen said in her first response, which was, these are the times to actually think about nuclear disarmament. And I actually think this is really, as previous speakers have highlighted, many of our leaders, and not only leaders, but also funders. I'm sending greetings to the Dutch Science Foundation, which on 23rd February sent me a rejection of my grant proposal saying that nuclear weapons are not an important issue on the international agenda today. I can give you the email address of NWO if you need it.
That's a good one.
This is not going to happen. I'm not going to get that rejection next time. So there is a lot of attention, and there is a lot of attention that this is really an important issue. And I agree with Harald that this may not be happening now, but people will sort of realize that nuclear disarmament is an important issue. And I think for that reason, we also need to start thinking about serious ways of actually achieving nuclear disarmament, which means that the campaigns, the goals, a lot of activism will actually, at some point, start to look at countries like Russia and at countries like China and start to stop focusing on a small group of democratic Western European countries and start to sort of be really global. Because if we want to have global nuclear disarmament, we will have to start thinking about these hard cases. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. On that note, I would like to open the debates and like to collect a few questions. The first question here, and then we have a second question.
Lots of questions.
Just the gentleman in the front, and then the lady over there, please.
If you allow, I have 2 points to make. And both will look at first sight maybe slightly bold. But I try to be, in the end, and I hope you understand that, reasonable. Now, my first point is, let's imagine for 1 second that I am President Biden, which I am fortunately not. It's an enormous responsibility. But if I would be President Biden, what would I do tomorrow? I would call tomorrow Mr. Putin and would say, my dear friend, hear what I have to say. You stop the war immediately. You have threatened other countries with nuclear arms. I threaten you now with our nuclear arms. I'm sure you don't like that tomorrow afternoon Moscow does not exist anymore. I do not like that Washington does not exist anymore. But we are in a similar situation as in Cuba in 1963. And you are now Khrushchev, and I am now Kennedy. And we should be at least be as intelligent as they were in 63. That means I was patient because I hoped that you come to an arrangement with Zelensky, whatever the arrangement is. And I have said not to intervene. But after this 4 weeks of criminal warfare, I cannot tolerate it for 1 second more. I have ordered that my nuclear weapons will be prepared. I hope not to be forced to push the red button. But as I said, you are now Khrushchev, and I am Kennedy. And we are bound, both, because the destiny of the world is in our hands now. We are bound both to find a solution. So think this night very carefully. I think also, and in 2 days, we will find a solution. So this is my first point.
Sorry, keep the second point short, please. I can imagine that we have many questions.
But it is not so
sure,
easy.
Absolutely, but please keep it short.
I'm now not Biden anymore. My second point is what Putin has done in threatening other countries with nuclear arms. He has undermined the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty because the other countries are put in the situation of self-defense. Self-defense is a priority above stated laws. And as it is a self-defense situation, other countries are now entitled also to build nuclear arms. When I am in this situation of self-defense, I can do what is necessary to stay alive. I do not want to undermine the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But I tell to Putin, what you do is to undermine in an irresponsible manner the NPT. You have met the others in the situation of self-defense, which gives them the right also to construct nuclear bombs, which we should, both Mr. Putin and myself, avoid.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I would like to take a second question by the lady over there. And then I have one question from the online audience, and then I would give back to the panel, please.
Yes, hello, my name is Sandra. I'm a second-year student here at the university and also in Dr. Senn's seminar at the moment about nuclear weapons. I have a question to Professor Pretorius about South Africa. So South Africa is a very special case because they did actually used to have nuclear weapons and then decided to renounce them. And then my question is, first, how do you see the future developments of South Africa and countries like South Africa, but then also more regionally, how Africa is very represented in the NAM and these justice imperceptions that keep rising, how you see the developments within the MPT structure? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a question from our online audience, and the question is by Nina Tannenwald. For those of you who follow the scholarship on nuclear weapons, Nina Tannenwald will be a very familiar name because she has published quite a lot on the nuclear taboo. So Nina, it's great that you are following our event. The question is, are any of you concerned that all the clickbait news stories on will Putin use nuclear weapons have a goading effect on Russian leaders? Maybe we start with you, Joelien, with the one question, and then I will hand the other questions to the other panelists.
Okay, thank you for that question. Usually the question is, why did South Africa give up nuclear weapons and what's the lesson? So the way I see things happening is that South Africa, along with other non-allied, non-nuclear weapon states in the NPT, will dig in their heels, will not accept any backtracking on disarmament benchmarks that have been made in previous NPT review conferences. So I see the next NPT review conference probably failing as a result of that, because the nuclear weapon states will dig in their heels and say now is not the time to talk about disarmament. So the groups will just pull apart. My own proposal to the NAM countries and the other non-allied nuclear weapon states is actually to withdraw from the NPT as a collective effort to do it by saying that the nuclear weapon states are in breach of Article 6, and that allows them to withdraw. this will send a very strong signal to the nuclear weapon states that their lack of disarmament and listening is unacceptable. But I do this with the proviso that these states must all be TPNW members, because that is what will have the moral suasion in this case. It will also bring the stigmatization that's normally reserved for proliferating countries to bear on the nuclear weapon states, and it will highlight this issue and the imbalance.
Thank you. I can see, Alexander, you want to respond to one of the questions?
Yes, I want to respond to Nina's question. I'm very concerned about that. We are actually in almost uncharted waters. We haven't had, luckily, that many crisis situations. We're looking at the Cuban crisis, but we had several near misses, but we haven't had many crises. And it's entirely possible that the current crisis will develop into an extremely high-pressured fog of war, as I mentioned, where the leaders are under unbelievable pressure, because who knows where this escalation ladder will lead to. And we then, essentially, the destiny of all humanity may be in the balance of how these decision makers decide. And the more we talk this up, the more the pressure to actually take this step might happen. And I have to respond to Joelien. She knows that I disagree with her point on the NPT, and also all states that support the TPNW are very staunch supporters of the NPT. So there is no reason and there is no market, I think, for taking a symbolic step of leaving the NPT, even though that, of course, the disarmament commitments are not implemented, but we have the NPT as the framework where the nuclear weapon states have given these commitments. So I think we would shoot ourselves in the foot, or states would shoot themselves in the foot by walking away from this treaty, where they actually have a treaty framework to engage with these states. So it's not perfect by no means. It's partly even very dysfunctional, but it is still an extremely important treaty, I would say. Thank you.
We still have one unanswered question or statement, and you want. Okay, perfect. Please.
Yes, I want to respond to President Biden. The first thing is, if you really wish to have two nuclear forces of several thousand warheads being on high alert while one party is in a war situation, you better reflect on the experience, the full experiences of Cuba. Cuba was resolved not by brilliant diplomacy, but by a lot of damned good luck, and the wisdom of a junior Soviet submarine officer. I don't want to see that sort of thing again. Second, Khrushchev is not Putin, and Putin is not Khrushchev. Khrushchev was by heart of a cooperative mind, and a very reasonable person who had some choleric presentations, but that should not mislead us. Putin is absolutely different, and I would not trust Putin to have that sort of reason in that situation. And thirdly, on one point I fully agree with you, I'm glad that you are not President Putin.
Oh, Biden.
No, President Biden.
Biden, yes. Sorry. Sorry.
Thank you for this clarification.
Carmen or Michal, anything that you would like to add to the questions or statements?
We can just take another question.
Okay.
Yeah. Let's take
Okay.
another round. Wow.
I saw that Gaucha had a question.
Many more.
Hi, thank you so much for this event. This is really exciting and interesting. for sad reasons, though. So I have a couple of questions, and one is about the relationship between the TPNW, NPT, and the existing divide among the NPT states parties on the TPNW. To what extent, it's probably a question to Alexander, but also others, to what extent do you think this current situation might actually bring the opposing parties closer together due to the emphasis that the TPNW places on not only disarmament but non-acquisition of nuclear weapons? And is there hope to emphasize that part of the TPNW, the role it plays in reinforcing almost the non-proliferation norm as well as promoting disarmament, whether that's kind of a positive that can be derived from the current situation? The next question is, and this might be a little meandering, but from the beginning of the NPT regime, the US and then Soviet Union, subsequently Russia to a lesser extent, were the keepers of the nuclear order. And then the US emerged as the hegemon and the keeper of nuclear order, and that role came into severe question during the previous US administration and some of the actions of the US vis-a-vis its treaty commitments. Now Russia is clearly the spoiler. To what extent do you think this would push the US back into the leading role in the nuclear order and sort of reinforce its position? Or are we looking at really reworking the whole system, and maybe some of the panelists' reactions to what William Walker said in terms of increasing potential role of China as possibly one of the keepers of the nuclear order? Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to take another question also by a DA student, maybe. I assume that you're a DA student. You're not. Are there any... So I'd like to take a question by a DA student, so give also the student audience a voice here. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all panelists and the mediator for the talk. My name is Isabel. I'm a DA student. And my question would be, in a hypothetical scenario that maybe it's not that hypothetical, that's the global security strategy becomes deterrence instead of arms control, then NPT would be obsolete, and what other instruments could be used? Or are we doomed to have a nuclear disorder in that hypothetical scenario? Thank you.
Thank you. I have another question by the lady in the front, a former student of mine. Please go ahead.
Thank you. So actually I have a question which fits quite well to the question, Gokar, to your first question. And while we heard so many foresights, when you posed, sorry, Martin, you posed the third question, your third question, we heard so many rather pessimistic foresights about how nuclear disarmament will be like in the next years. So I was wondering, given the current situation, could there not also be like or could the current situation not also affect the TPNW in a also positive way? For example, by being a sort of catalyst for other states to adhere to the treaty. So this would be my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think there is a lot that we can answer to those questions. Maybe Carmen, I would like to start with you. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for these questions. And I think I like to comment on the questions regarding the relationship between the NPT and the TPNW. And I think, Joelien, you also know that I don't like the suggestion to ditch the NPT. Basically, the NPT is, I don't like this metaphor of cornerstone, but it's an essential element of the nuclear order, as is the TPNW. And I think this is the new normal, right? There are two treaties that are complementary, and I think both have their functions. The NPT has its problems, the TPNW has its problems as well, and states need to work on both treaties, on both problems, and they need to find bridges. And actually, I also thought about the only positive development that I could come up with, and I forgot to mention that in my remarks, was that perhaps the polarization or the polarized debate or the polarization between the TPNW community on the one side and the NPT community on the other side might soften. That's the only positive development that I could really come up with, and I think there are some prospects because we see a new unity in I was inclined to say the West, but I think it's the world against the illegal invasion of Ukraine. And perhaps that has an effect on how this polarized debate evolves, maybe. Could the TPNW be a catalyst and bring more states to actually adhere to the treaty? I'm pessimistic on that one. I think I hope, and the signs from Germany are quite well, that allies such as Germany will observe the first meeting of states parties, which is going to happen in June. And this is really good because I think it's important to show that kind of commitment to critically engage with the norms enshrined in the TPNW. But I personally, I wouldn't be overly optimistic that the pace of states adhering to the TPNW is as fantastic as it has been in the past because of the recent developments in Ukraine.
Thank you. Alexander?
Thanks. Again, many points. I wanted to react also to Carmen. I don't know if you misspoke, but you presented it as if there is a sort of competition between the TPNW and the NPT community, and that's not.
Say that.
Sorry.
No?
Sorry, no. Then I misspoke. No.
Because that's not the case. Because of course the TPNW states are all in the NPT, and the arguments in favor of nuclear disarmament in the NPT are shared by the vast majority of states. I think the current development may actually lead to more support for the TPNW in other parts of the world, because it is blatantly obvious that progress on disarmament in the NPT, at least at the moment, is very difficult. So if states want to underline the importance of progress on nuclear disarmament, they will do it in the NPT, but a tangible step they can take is by supporting the TPNW. I also think that maybe with some of the countries that are currently opposed to the TPNW, there might be a reassessment, not that they necessarily join the treaty, but what we are seeing, if the nuclear order is in danger of crumbling, is it better for more states to add another legal layer, which is not only for disarmament, which is the TPNW, but also the stigmatization of nuclear weapons, and thereby a very strong strengthening of the nuclear taboo and the non-proliferation measure. So I would say that maybe the most extreme opponents will continue to be extremely opposed, but for other opponents, there is a realization that this is actually, the TPNW is a constructive step that strengthens the nuclear order, which is absolutely needed at the moment. So that has, I think, a great potential to make the debate a little bit more softer and a little bit more constructive than has been the case from some of the opponents, I would say. And lastly, I think that the question was from Isabel. If the nuclear order crumbles, and as you said, if deterrence is the way, it means proliferation. It means the logical conclusion of this argument is that if the idea of nuclear disarmament is ditched, and everybody thinks that nuclear weapons are the answer, then everybody has these weapons. And the simple question is this a safer world? And for me, the answer to that is blatantly obvious. So we have no other alternative than to do whatever we can to prevent exactly these conclusions from being taken. So that's why I'm also so worried in a way about the re-emphasis on nuclear deterrence, as understandable as the security concerns are. I'm concerned about this because, of course, it sets an example. If everybody in Europe thinks that, then why shouldn't everybody else think the same? And that is a world, ultimately, that is not something that we want.
Thank you. Harald? What? No? Joelien?
So yes, on the NPT and the TPNW being complementary, I disagree with this because the NPT has this unacknowledged pillar which is nuclear deterrence for the nuclear weapon states. And as long as you have nuclear deterrence as a pillar, nuclear weapons is the consequence. Possession is legal. For 52 years now, nuclear weapon states have said they will disarm, they will disarm, they will disarm. They make promises, they break promises. How long must we wait for this treaty to deliver a world without nuclear weapons? The TPNW has only one ordering principle, and that is the elimination of nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
So I understand that diplomats like Ambassador Kmentt says the TPNW is actually the realization of Article 6. It builds on that. It builds on a normative environment. And over time, the nuclear weapon states will come to be pressurized by this normative environment. I don't think so. Maybe I'm more of a realist in that sense. On the issue of the effect on the TPNW from the crisis, I think that many more states will leave the door open, the nuclear door, will leave their options open instead of closing it completely. Having said that, I think in the NPT review conference that's coming up, we could see that nuclear weapon states, in order to do something positive for other states not to leave the NPT, they might include a conversation of the TPNW. So at least recognizing the TPNW as an effort in terms of Article 6. But that would be like throwing a bone. I'm very cynical about what the nuclear weapon states will do.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Pretorius said, how long must we wait for a treaty that will deliver on nuclear disarmament? Well, we don't have a treaty that can realistically deliver on nuclear disarmament at the moment in the world, so we will have to wait for a better treaty. I respectfully disagree with the point that was raised by Ambassador Kmentt in response to Isabella's question. So Isabella asked about a hypothetical scenario where deterrence becomes the norm. What will that lead to disorder? My answer to that is not necessarily. If deterrent thinking is going to be strengthened, that doesn't necessarily need to lead to more horizontal or vertical proliferation. It may just mean a lot of uncertainty and a lot of risks for miscalculation and for accidental war, which is not a pleasant world to live in. But it doesn't necessarily need to lead to more vertical proliferation and horizontal either. I would have a hard time imagining that countries that are sort of, if you think about countries that are sort of toying with the idea of developing nuclear weapon, I cannot imagine any of them looking at Ukraine and thinking, maybe we need to get a nuclear weapon. Maybe I'm wrong on this. But I don't think the further proliferation is a natural consequence of a world of nuclear deterrence.
Thank you. Now, I would like to take two final questions and then give our panelists the opportunity to wrap up, because time is already almost coming to an end. So I would like to take two questions, one from the side here and then a second one, please.
Thank you very much for your discussion. My name is Alexander, I'm also a student here at the DA, and I hope that with my question I'm not engaging in what was called but I have a technical question concerning the new weapon technology of hypersonic missiles. And to my understanding, this technology is available to Russia and China, but not the US. And I also believe that this technology can carry strategic nuclear warheads. So I wanted to ask technology have the potential to tip the balance in nuclear deterrence?
Thank you very much. And the very final question by Ambassador Soltanay, please.
Well, thank you very much. I commend all the deliberations. One thing that was missing today was talking about the root cause of this whole crisis. We expect the academia at least to be very frank. NATO has made a strategic mistake of provocation. NATO having nuclear weapon, going, as it was nicely said, of course, close to the border, threatening the Russians, despite of previous warning and years ago of this commitment, non-compliance with that commitment. Therefore, let's be realistic. We have to blame NATO of this provocation and creating this crisis, unnecessary crisis, while of course we have to condemn the aggression. Of course, there's no doubt about it. We have to be very fair. And another point is, of course, this issue of the NATO. Don't forget we are talking about TPW, that which of course supporting principle. I congratulate Austria for being proponent of this one. But one of the main opponents of this treaty and boycotting even negotiation were NATO. NATO members and US. We just lose sight of all these kind of things what's going on. And the last point, we are paying the price, all of us, international community, for years applauding our nuclear arms control. Which arms control, nuclear arms control, it has legitimate already the nuclear weapons. Russians, Soviets, or US have for years deceived the international community that we are working on that direction. The situation now proves that arms control was a mistake, and the people supporting or hoping that that would work was a mistake. The last point, of course, there was a good comment about attacking nuclear installations. I'm proud to say that 32 years ago, I proposed in the IAEA resolution, you can see it after this meeting, Resolution 533 of 1990, which in fact clearly says attack or even threat of attack against nuclear installations is violation of UN Charter, IAEA statute, and international treaties. And this was in fact proposed, and UN Security Council should immediately act. This is of course a resolution, and surprisingly after years, I noticed that in draft resolution by EU and others against Russia in the IAEA, a couple of weeks ago, in fact less than 2 weeks ago, they referred to my resolution 533. But anyway, there is a resolution. Of course, we have to strengthen this approach so that there would be a real taboo of any attack against nuclear installation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So many things that we have to reply to, many things that we can say. As I mentioned before, so this will be the final round of statements. So please keep it short if that's possible with that topic. And Michal, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Soltanay, I never thought that I will meet a person that combines John Mearsheimer and Beatrice Finn in one. So I'm very pleased to see that, because you basically merged Mearsheimer's thinking about the origins of war and Beatrice Finn's equivalence between Russian action and the NATO nuclear deterrent posture. But I think seeing NATO, the thing about NATO expansion, of course, is about, and I don't want to, I've heard it multiple times today, and I want to sort of push back against it, that somehow NATO brought nuclear weapons to Russian border. There is a thing called NATO-Russia Founding Act that prohibits stationing of nuclear weapons on the territory of new member states, which NATO has sort of held up scrupulously. It also prohibits NATO to station permanently troops in the territory of new member states. So for that reason, NATO sort of keeps a limited amount of troops in these countries. And so we shouldn't try to come up with alternative facts in talking about different issues. You may also be, for example, pleased to learn that Russian own military manual forbids any military attacks on nuclear installations. It can be found in the study on international humanitarian law by the International Committee of the Red Cross. clearly those rules don't mean a lot to the current Russian leadership. And so the resolution like the one that you mentioned is very welcome, but we also need to be aware of the limit that national or international laws put on the current Russian leadership. Thank you.
Thank you. Joelien, please.
Do we answer the questions or do we make final statements?
Both. Both in short, please.
Okay, so I won't answer the questions. I just want to say that the nuclear order has been in trouble before the Ukraine. There's already a new nuclear arms race going on. Several states are increasing. China and the UK have said they'll increase their warheads. The nuclear weapon states are backtracking on these benchmarks of disarmament. They now want to create an environment for nuclear disarmament, which makes nuclear disarmament conditional on all tensions in the world being solved. Which is, how can that happen? You know, that just is wishful thinking. So they are just postponing. And then Russia is threatening a non-nuclear weapon state. So, in my opinion, the crossroads where we are at is one where we choose nuclear deterrence or we choose the elimination of nuclear weapons. The NPT, unfortunately, in my opinion, will not work because it's trying to mix both of these ordering principles in one. Nuclear deterrence for some, elimination for others. That double standard is the source of a lot of insecurity and unraveling that we see. So the crossroads is the NPT or the TPNW for me.
Thank you. I'd now like to hand over to William Walker. William, please.
Thank you. I would just like to add a comment about China. I think it was Nina Tannenwald who raised the issue again. There has been concern for quite a long time, of course, that China might attempt a military takeover of Taiwan. And you can read its plan to expand its nuclear arsenal partly in that context, as wishing to deter the United States and others from intervening on Taiwan's behalf if it did try a military takeover. And I hope that, and I think there's some evidence that in fact it is forcing a rethink in China of this whole question. And one hopes that the US and China and others will return to the issue and find another accommodation of this problem that will be lasting. But I think that if you look overall, there's no country on earth that is in fact more threatened with nuclear weapons than China. It's encircled by Russia to the north, by the Americans and the North Koreans to the west, to the east, and India, Pakistan to the south. And so to date, they've largely been a free rider, China, and they haven't been helpful in relation to North Korea and Pakistan. But nevertheless, they do have a great interest in the maintenance of a set of rules and norms and nuclear order. And so I very much hope that they can begin thinking about stepping up, you might say, and becoming a partner in this whole creation of a stronger nuclear order. And if they did signal they were prepared to do that, I think it would make a very great difference. I would encourage everyone to speak to the Chinese and to encourage that in every possible way.
Thank you. Harald, please.
Yes, I want to support Michal by pointing out that no NATO nuclear weapons has moved eastwards, and that the accession to NATO and NATO enlargement was due by the free will of the countries who acceded and who felt threatened by Russia because of permanent overflights by the Russian Air Force, intrusion into territorial waters by the Russian Navy, cyber operations and agitation of Russian origin citizens on their territories. And I want to try to answer the question for the hypersonic weapons. I do not see these weapons changing the balance because they do not concern the enormous offensive potential by the United States. What they do is they can easier deny anti-missile defenses because they are not on a ballistic curve, and therefore equal or equalize an advantage which the Americans may have had by their ballistic defense.
Thank you. Alexander, please.
Thank you. I think it's clear the NATO expansion to the east is supported by the vast majority of those states, has democratic legitimacy, and is very strongly supported and comes out of a very clear historical experience. So I think that would be my answer to that. On the hypersonic weapons, I, in a way, disagree with Professor Müller. I think they are vastly destabilizing because they, of course, can carry either nuclear or non-nuclear weapons. They shorten the decision time dramatically. A decision maker in a crisis would not know what comes. The risk for accidents, the risk for deciding under pressure becomes enormously high. So I think it's extremely bad news, and it's part of a whole range of new technological developments that have a profound impact on the stability of nuclear deterrence. The cyber dimension is another one, artificial intelligence is another one. All of this will have a very important repercussions on the deterrence debate. And if I can make one last point on the TPNW. First of all, the TPNW was objected to not only by NATO but by many more, namely everybody who's part of the nuclear hegemony. All the states that have these weapons and all the states that rely on these weapons don't like the TPNW because it delegitimizes the weapon. That was, of course, within NATO, but it's equally Russia, China, and the other nuclear armed states also don't support it. But the TPNW is a new norm, which of course applies for the states that ratify the treaty, and we can't force this on anybody else. But it's also a proposition for a conversation. And the conversation that is being asked to have is that nuclear deterrence is a psychological construct. And right now we're seeing absolutely the limits of this construct. We don't know if it works. We cannot prove the negative. We cannot say that because 70 years there hasn't been a nuclear war, that's a proof for nuclear deterrence working. So it's an assumption. And of course we hope that it will remain stable, but we don't know. But we have empirically demonstrable facts on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, which are far greater than anybody has understood, and that the risks of nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence are also far more considerable and actually increasing. So at some stage this discussion has to be had about the assumed stability that nuclear deterrence is supposed to bring, which we hope is the case, but we can't prove, against the consequences and risks that we can actually prove. And I think that is a very important discussion that needs to be had.
Thank you. Carmen, you have the final word.
There's not really much to add because everything that I wanted to say has already been said in this last round. I also wanted to, with regard to the NATO question, I also wanted to put the focus back on Ukraine because we are talking a lot about what is happening in Ukraine, but often the will to self-determine their own destiny is disregarded. And I think it's important, Harald and Ambassador Kmentt already mentioned this point. When we talk about NATO enlargement, we need to talk about those who actually want to join NATO for whatever reasons. And I think self-determination is a very important norm, which leads me to a second point. And I hope to get out of this discussion with a positive note on norms in general, because when we look at nuclear norms, norms are always connected. There are interrelations with other orders, other normative structures. And self-determination is one norm, sovereignty is another norm. Norms are interpreted in different ways. But of course, what we also see in this whole horrible war right now is a strong condemnation. We cannot change what is happening there, and our hands are kind of bound to really stop the suffering by the people in Ukraine. But we also see a strong normative resolve by the international community. And I think this is really something that gave me at least a bit of hope that there are norm violations going on, terrible and horrible norm violations, but norms are still important. And there are also a lot of states adhering to norms, following norms, upholding these norms. And I think we should really remind ourselves that there is also this positive glimmer, I would almost say. Yeah, I think I leave it here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Carmen. I was actually thinking very hard about how to end this panel debate on a positive note, and I think very well done. Thank you very much. There are only two further positive points that I would like to add, or positive notes maybe. The first one was already mentioned, so I think if there is something positive coming out of the current situation, then it's really that many more people will start thinking about nuclear weapons, and when many more people start thinking, at the end of the day, I hope and I assume that there will be also a positive output. So that's the one positive note. And the second one is that over there, there is wine and water that may help you to wash down some of the negative things that you heard in the past 2 hours. On that note, I would like to thank the panelists for their great comments. I would like to thank you and also the online audience for your great questions. And I wish you a nice evening and hope to see many of you, or maybe all of you, soon. Thank you very much.